Good afternoon, everyone. Today I am joined by Matt Leach, who is the Chief Executive of Local Trust, where I'm the Head of Local Public Services Research at New Local. And Matt and I are going to have a conversation about something that is a bit of a game changer, and if it comes off, and that is the Community Wealth Fund. I'm not going to tell you too much more about it. That's why we've got Matt here today to tell you more. So, Matt, if you are ready, I'm going to kick off with my first question. So most of our audience will have perhaps heard of the Community Wealth Fund, but might not be clear on what it means. Can you briefly give us an overview of what it actually is?
Well, the Community Wealth Fund is a proposal that's been made to government by what's now a huge coalition of organisations spanning city mayors, local authorities, health bodies, not-for-profit organisations, funders like ourselves. And what we're asking of government is that they commit a significant amount of the next wave of dormant assets. These are, the leftover bank accounts that have funded the likes of Big Society Capital or the Youth Endowment Foundation over the last 10 to 15 years. A new wave of dormant assets is about to be released. Share certificates, leftover insurance policies. Could be as much as £1 billion, maybe over time £2 billion. And we're campaigning to say that a significant element of that should be committed to rebuilding the social infrastructure of some of our most deprived communities.
So why is a fund needed like this, in your view?
I guess, if you look at the stats, you can start to map out bits of the country that are deprived, and we all know where they are. As the local authorities, hugely aware of the places which place highest demands on services, which have highest levels of poverty and deprivation, which are suffering particularly during the current cost of living crisis. But we know from looking at statistics that within those, the areas that are doing worst are those areas where social infrastructure has decayed over time. And quite often these are estates on the edge of towns or cities, the places perhaps that were set up as overspill estates or perhaps neighbourhoods that were serving the needs of industry that's long since disappeared. And often these are places that have, not just suffered from economic decline, but have seen a loss of pubs, clubs, places to meet, institutes, community centres, the sorts of places that bring people together, and also the sorts of organisations that help organise, that help bring funds in. And these communities, and we call them left behind communities for want of a better term, when you look at the stats, you see these are places that do much worse when it comes to social outcomes, that actually bring in significantly less grant funding from grant funders like ourselves, from the lottery, because there aren't people to ask for funds, and which actually suffer from significantly worse quality of life indicators just because of that lack of ability to bring people together. It's not that they aren't strong communities, but often they lack the building blocks that make places nice places to live, good, strong places to live. And I know from talking to chief executives, council leaders around the country that they can see that as well. You go from ward to ward and you'll see some wards which are highly deprived, but they're buzzing with activity. There's stuff going on. You can make a difference by perhaps reaching out, bringing organizations together, putting a small amount of money in to enable stuff to get happening. But then there are also places perhaps where there's less of that civic life, where actually there's a huge burden placed on, particularly on local statutory agencies, to make stuff happen, to reach out. I think one chief exec I was talking to recently said, if he measured where his money was going in to address need, he knew small amounts of money could make a difference in some communities, but in other communities, you'd have to be spending years to really make a difference. And what we'd like to see from a community wealth fund is long-term patient investment to support that sort of outreach, to rebuild civic organisations, to rebuild the sorts of places that people will come together and meet in, to get community activity going again. It's the sort of work we've been doing in local trust through the Big Local Fund for the last 10 to 15 years across 150 areas in the country. And frankly, our experience shows that a lot more of it's needed.
Funny enough, I was going to ask you, Matt, about your own funds. Have you got any examples of where an approach like this is already working?
There's so many great examples. I spend a lot of my time going around the country visiting brilliant people in amazing communities making such a difference to lives, often based on what can happen when you put resources in communities in for the long term and trust local people to make decisions, but then sit back and watch how that releases resources from everywhere else. It builds the foundations for really effective partnerships. And a great example of that is Lawrence Weston in Bristol, in Avonmouth, where you see a community that's often felt neglected and ignored. Certainly that's what they would have told you if you went 10, 15 years ago. But over the last decade, they've been transforming the area. They brought in new business. They've built new social housing. They've supported existing social fabric. So community centres that otherwise would have closed. I think they recently built a new BMX track, and really their crowning achievement most recently is working with Bristol City Council and the local Bristol Energy Company to put in place a huge solar farm and what's going to be the biggest wind turbine in Britain, which is going to provide funds which will help sustain social activity on well into the future without anywhere near as much of a need for reliance on the state as perhaps might have existed in the past. But it's not just the big stuff. Recently I was down in Newington in Thanet. There's a fantastic community organisation that has taken long-term funding to build capacity, to bring local people on board and get them involved in making a difference in an estate which has had problems in the past, but now is an amazing place with art everywhere. When I was there, they brought a theatre and a tent in for the week to provide theatre on an estate which is just well away from any theatres that local people might want to go to, where the community centre has been a hub for tackling the cost of living crisis. And actually what they're doing is so impressive that recently the council committed quite significant amounts of levelling up funds, I think getting on for £500,000, to extend and improve the community centre, just to build on the achievements of the last 10 years. Now, I'm sure when the Community Wealth Fund is implemented, it will look slightly different from Big Local. There may be, different delivery mechanics. There may be different timeframes, but I think what will be really important if it's to succeed is that it takes with it some of the great stuff that underpins the Big Local programme, and that's long-term patient funding, people being put in the lead, and a real focus on rebuilding the social fabric of places that perhaps have missed out in the past.
So many of our audience are working in local authorities, and they'll be sitting here listening to you, Matt, going, this sounds fantastic, but what's my role in this? How do you see local authorities working with the Community Wealth Fund to capitalise on some of those benefits that you've just mentioned?
I think we know that lots of local authorities have great relationships with their local communities, and I think the best local authorities recognise now, and actually New Local's been in the forefront of pushing this as a message. The best local authorities see their communities as a resource and a partner to help design, to help deliver services, as much as being a passive recipient of spending. So I think local authorities have got to be seen as key partners with communities when it comes to making the most of the Community Wealth Fund. The Big Local model, and I guess I'd certainly advise ministers to look at that if they're designing a Community Wealth Fund, is one of money being put straight into communities. So communities are able to take the initiative. So they're incentivized to organize themselves, to move from perhaps sometimes being stuck in a role of being the ones who complain, or the ones who petition, to being people who can negotiate, who can bring solutions to the table, who can partner with local government. And certainly that's a model that you can see elsewhere in the world. In the US, there's some examples from the Joe Biden's community revitalization funding, again, of national government putting money directly down into the hands of communities so they can then partner effectively with municipalities to make a difference. I think trying to change the dynamic. So we're not always assuming that everything has to come through some sort of cascaded mechanism down through different tiers of government, with each doing what the tier above perhaps directs, but starting to accept that power can be spread right across society. And actually, what's really important is realizing partnership and potential at all levels.
Matt, isn't there an argument that this money should just be going to local authorities in order to control and fund what they see fit?
I think it's incredibly important that as the community wealth funds designed, that local authorities, particularly local authorities who got left behind communities on their patches, are involved in discussions about where the money goes. What are the areas the places that need to be prioritised, and actually how can this sort of funding link into other work that's being done to transform where people, the nature of the places where people live. In terms of the funding itself and how it's distributed, I think in some ways that's a bit of a technical question you'd have to put to civil servants rather than to me. It's the money comes through a particular route which involves financial services organisations putting funds into a reclaim fund, which then holds it for a while before distributing it to what are defined in legislation as defined good causes. So it's not like standard public expenditure or funding that travels down through the local government settlements. So it couldn't be done in traditional funding routes, but I'd be incredibly surprised if when the Community Wealth Fund is rolled out, if it isn't done so in a way which really incentivizes proper engagement and involvement between local authorities and local people. But I think where it works best is, where Big Local works best is where communities and local government partner, where they see the strengths that are brought to the table by both sides. And there's a real focus on enabling, on realizing potential, and frankly, making a difference to local people's lives, which is what everybody's in the game for anyway, aren't they?
Why is the Community Wealth Fund targeted at deprived areas when those areas already have access to other areas of funding, such as the Levelling Up Fund?
So the main difference is that the Community Wealth Fund's campaigning for hyperlocal funding. So this is funding at a neighbourhood, at a housing estate level, which is very different from the sorts of funding that's come out through UK SPF, through the Towns Fund, through Levelling Up money. It's not that some of that money doesn't sometimes get out to left behind neighbourhoods, but actually we're talking about funding at a very different scale, at LSOA or sub-LSOA level. I think the second answer is all about timing. Government funding is great, capital funding to take on assets or, to do up the high street. But actually, when you're talking about making profound changes to the social fabric of places, rebuilding civic organization, creating sustainable community spaces where perhaps they might have disappeared 5, 10, 15 years ago with the loss of workplaces, with the loss of trade union organization, with all the stuff that used to underpin many of those communities, you can be talking about a 10-year, a 15-year mission to make a difference. So I think this is a different sort of funding that we think should be provided in a different sort of way, long-term, place-based, with actually quite a lot of support wrapped around it. Well, so, I'd hope that it would complement work going on to support Levelling Up. I think earlier I mentioned Newington and the fantastic collaboration that appears to be developing there between the local community and the council. But actually, it's got to be different, and I think to make a difference, it's got to be long term, and that's why dormant assets is such a good funding source to provide that.
So the proposal has already been out for consultation. What happens next for your campaign?
I guess we're waiting. I mean, it's coming up to Christmas, and obviously there's lots going on. There's a lot of snow outside at the moment, and ministers are somewhere warm inside DCMS, looking at a huge pile of consultation responses. There were thousands of responses to the consultation. We think hundreds of them came from organisations, institutions that supported proposals for a community wealth fund. We've seen people like Tracy Crouch writing an op-ed in favour that came out in City AM yesterday. Last week, we saw a large number of MPs from across parties holding a debate in Westminster Hall, calling for a community wealth fund to be implemented. I understand that the Bishop of Manchester has also written to the minister. In fact, quite a few bishops have written. So there's a really broad-based coalition of people saying to the minister, now is the time to take this opportunity to commit long-term money to communities, help them make a difference. But in the end, it's for ministers to decide where they think they can have most impact with dormant asset fund.
So, Matt, for those of people listening who want to get involved in the campaign or find out more, where can they go for further information?
Well, I guess the starting point is the Community Wealth Fund Alliance's website, which is www.communitywealthfund.org.uk. There's a whole load of resources there, which makes which will help people who are interested to both get on top of what the case is for a community wealth fund, but also find out how they can contribute to helping ministers hopefully make the right decision when it comes to what happens next.
Well, here's hoping for a very joyous start to 2023. Thank you so much for joining me today, Matt.